Hello, and welcome to week 3 of the People of Faith Bible Study. Thank you for joining me. I'm Kristie McAllister, and I'm excited to talk to you today about people in the Bible who lived by faith and not by sight. We are discussing Hebrews 11, 23 through 40 today, if you want to follow along. If you haven't watched weeks 1 and 2 of this Bible study, please go watch those. These stories build on one another, and to get the full picture of what God calls us to do, I think you would benefit from starting at the beginning of this series. Hebrews 11 is full of stories that help us open our eyes to the world around us. Most of these exact circumstances won't happen to us, but we can learn a lot about how God guides these people and uses them to his glory. So let's talk about Moses. His full story begins in Exodus 2. In Hebrews 11, where we're studying today, we see how Moses followed God's call to bring the Hebrews out of Egypt. Let's read Hebrews 11:23. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. I'm reading the New Living Translation. This version calls him an unusual child. Other versions translate that word as beautiful or not ordinary or proper. In Exodus 2:2, we see the Bible calls him special. No matter what word you use, his parents could see that he was different. We talked last week about being set apart. Our faith makes us different from the rest of the world. Even as a 3-month-old, God made Moses different. The author of Hebrews also points out that Moses' parents were not afraid to disobey the king's command. They had faith in God, not their earthly leader. Our leaders sometimes have very different values than God. They have finite goals. God's goals are eternal. We talked about having a kingdom focus in the last video. We set our sights on things that are eternal. Sometimes the right thing is not the lawful thing. The Pharaoh told his people to kill all the newborn Hebrew boys, but some of those Egyptians refused to follow that order. There will be times that the world does not align with God's will, and we have to be prepared to follow God. Moses followed his parents' example as he was called by God to save his people from the evil Pharaoh. In verses 24 through 26 of Hebrews 11, we skip to when Moses was an adult. It says, "It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to know the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward." So Moses had access to all of Egypt. Just like we saw with Joseph, Moses was in a place to have anything he wanted. He had access to all the earthly rewards he could ever ask for. But let's read verse 25 again. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He stepped down out of his palace to walk among the people. He saw how hard they were being worked and beaten. But Moses knew a vital piece of information. Our first point today is our true and lasting reward is in heaven. Our true and lasting reward is in heaven. Luke 12:21 says, "Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God." In this passage, Jesus is telling a story about a rich man that instead of giving away his extra crops to those that were hungry, he wants to tear down his barns and build bigger ones. So Jesus calls him a fool. We don't know how long we have to live on this earth, but we know our relationship with God will last forever. So why don't we prioritize that? Nothing on this earth will come with us when we die. So why do we desire things of this earth? It's because our flesh lies to us. It tells us that the stuff will satisfy us. It's the path of least resistance. Following God isn't easy. That's why we want free 2-day shipping and food through a drive-through in less than 90 seconds, right? But getting everything we want is not good for us. As a parent, I constantly have to remind my children that they don't always get what they want, but they will always have the things they need. We yearn for stuff because we sense something is missing. The only thing that will fill that hole in our hearts is the Holy Spirit. All the money and status in the world would never fill that gap. We still feel empty inside until we let the Holy Spirit in. Moses chose not to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He chose to follow God's will instead. Our mission on earth is to follow his lead where he calls, and call others to follow. That's the Great Commission. So we see Moses leading where God calls in verse 27. Let's read that. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who was invisible. So that leads us to point number 2. The fear of the Lord is our strength. The fear of the Lord is our strength. The meaning of the phrase, the fear of the Lord, was revealed to me in a Starbucks drive-thru. Yeah, that sounds crazy. I wanted to better understand what that meant. I knew that it wasn't like, I'm afraid of God. But what did it mean? So as I sat there in line, I began praying, asking God to help me see what the fear of the Lord was. I thanked him for this beautiful morning, like the sun was rising. It was gorgeous. And I said, I am in awe of you. And there it was. When the Holy Spirit talks to me, it's usually accompanied by tears. That's how I know that he's with me and I'm just overcome with this emotion. That's how I know God is speaking. God speaks to everyone differently, but that's how I feel his presence. So in that moment, I knew God was telling me, when you're in awe of me, you understand my power and my might. The fear of the Lord is knowing that he has the power to do anything he wants. It is also understanding that he loves us more than anything else he created. Matthew 6:30 says, and if God cares so wonderfully for wildflowers that are here today and thrown in the fire tomorrow, he will certainly care for you. Why do you have so little faith? Our faith cannot be tied to our stuff or to other people. It has to be tied to God. Think of God as our anchor. Anchors are meant to keep a boat in place when you don't want them to move. When God is our anchor, we only move when he does. We go where he goes. We follow where he leads. Hebrews 6:18 and 19 says, therefore, we who have fled to him for refuge can have great confidence as we hold to the hope that lies before us. This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. When we trust God, we have hope for an eternity in heaven. Nothing can compare to what we will experience in heaven. So many people get wrapped up in what's happening in the world right now. What if we were wrapped up in the beauty heaven will offer us instead? What if we loved God and loved each other? That's it. What would the world look like then if we just simply loved each other and truly cared about each other? Let's keep reading. Verse 28 says, it was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and to sprinkle blood on the doorposts so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons. God told Moses to lead the Hebrews out of Egypt. However, Pharaoh was not so keen on that idea. So God sent many plagues upon Egypt, the last being the death of every firstborn son in Egypt. In Exodus 11, Moses tells Pharaoh what God said would happen, but Pharaoh didn't believe him. In Exodus 12, Moses tells the Hebrews how to protect themselves from this last plague. So in Exodus 12, verses 21 through 23, let's read that. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel together and said to them, go pick out a lamb or young goat for each of your families and slaughter the Passover animal. Drain the blood into a basin, then take a bundle of hyssop branches and dip it into the blood. Brush the hyssop across the top and sides of the door frames of your houses, and no one may go out through the door until morning. For the Lord will pass through the land and strike down the Egyptians. But when he sees the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe, the Lord will pass over your home. He will not prevent his death angel to enter your house or strike you down. God offered them protection before he provided freedom. Jehovah Jireh means he will provide. He provided for the Israelites, and he'll provide for all you need as well. When we walk in obedience, God blesses us. I've seen it over and over again in my life and all throughout the Bible. The Israelites remained faithful, and the angel of death passed over them. They were safe, and they were about to be free. Hebrews 11:29 says, "It was by faith that the people of Israel went right through the Red Sea, as though they were on dry ground. But then the Egyptians tried to follow, and they were all drowned." We were reading a great book in September by Carlos Whitaker called Enter Wild. Carlos starts chapter 3 talking about this very scene at the Red Sea. With the Egyptians hot on the Israelites' heels and this huge sea blocking their way, the Israelites freaked out. They actually asked Moses if they could go back. We'll get to that in a minute. Moses' response to their freak out is in Exodus 14:13. He says, "Don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Lord himself will fight for you today." I want to read on page 31 of Enter Wild by Carlos Whitaker, a little quote. He says, "When they stood still, when they relaxed, when they stood still long enough for God to come in and work in ways only God can work, wild happened." Work in ways only God can work. We are not capable of doing everything. We aren't even capable of doing 10% of what God can do, but somehow we try to. I was listening to Jireh, which is a song by Elevation Worship and Maverick City Music, the other day, and one line caught my attention. "Wasn't holding you up, so there's nothing I can do to let you down." Why do we give ourselves so much credit? We literally can't do it all. Please know that I'm preaching this heavily to myself right now. This is something I struggle with. But we can't let God down because we were never holding him up. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Knowing is something I constantly feel the need to do. I pray to know God's plan for my life. I pray to know what to do. But God recently showed me that I need to turn my prayers from "help me to know" to "help me to trust you." And man, what a difference that has made. It takes all the power out of my hands and places it where it belongs, in the hands of the one that can actually handle it. At the Red Sea, the Israelites actually begged Moses to take them back to Egypt. They wanted to go back to captivity because that's what they knew. That's what felt normal. This new journey was unknown and terrifying. I think that sounds crazy. But don't we do that? We keep trying to go back to that thing that we were chained to, and God keeps guiding us back onto the path he laid out for us. God sent the Israelites on another interesting path. They walked around a city. So let's read verse 30. "It was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the walls came crashing down." When we talk about a walk of faith, we aren't exactly talking about this kind of walk, but this is certainly a walk of faith. I try to think about what the Israelites were thinking. I've never walked around a wall and had it fall before. Where are our weapons? Why are the priests leading this mission? Why are the musicians on the front line? I would have these questions, wouldn't you? That doesn't make any earthly sense. But that's why we have to be set apart, because following God won't always make sense at first. But when you look back at what you've gone through, you can see where God has worked and where he was moving. They followed God's plan and the wall came tumbling down. No one used a weapon. They simply walked the path laid out for them and were obedient to God's call. Rahab was also obedient to God's call, and it saved her and her whole family. Verse 31 says, "It was by faith that Rahab the prostitute was not destroyed with the people in her city who refused to obey God, for she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. So we see this full story in Joshua 2. 2 Israelites went ahead of the rest of the group to go spy on Jericho. Rahab took those spies in. She was terrified of the Israelites, but she still let these spies into her home. In turn, the Israelites saved Rahab and her whole family from death because she helped them. In fact, she became part of the Israelites because of her obedience to God. So we notice that Rahab was a prostitute. She was not an upstanding citizen, but God still used her to carry out his plan. So number 3 today is we don't have to be perfect. We just have to be willing. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be willing. Don't wrap yourself up in all the rules of being a Christian. Jesus died on the cross to take our place. He offered us grace when he died for us. That means it's okay to mess up. Do you feel that weight lift off your shoulders? You don't have to have it all together all the time. That's not what the Christian life is about. We can fail, and God is right there offering us his hand to help us up. That doesn't mean you should keep sinning, knowing you are wrong. Romans 2:12 and 13 says, if you sin without knowing what you're doing, God takes that into account. But if you sin knowing full well what you're doing, that's a different story entirely. When you follow Jesus and have faith in him, he will turn your heart away from sin, and you will want to follow his lead. That's how he sets us apart. He changes our perspective. There are many other people in the Bible that had immense faith and leaned on Jesus. Verses 32 through 38 of Hebrews 11 speak of many others who served God. Some were even tortured for their faith. They literally walked through fire and were beaten and killed because of their faith. It's important to remember, though, that they received a heavenly reward for their sacrifice. Verses 39 and 40 say, all these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised, for God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. The people we have talked about in this Bible study series did not get to see Jesus walk this earth. They died without God's promise fully fulfilled. Perfection in verse 40 means completion. This verse is referring to God's mission to send Jesus. It was not finished before these faithful people died. But somehow they all remained faithful, even without ever seeing the finish line. So what can we take away from these incredible people of faith? There are many blessings on the other side of obedience. The obedience in itself may be hard, painful, or even deadly, but heaven is our ultimate blessing. We can't even imagine what heaven will look like. It is so incredible that our human brains can't even comprehend. So, the last few weeks, we've talked about what faith is and why it is so important. Next week, we're going to wrap up this series by looking into Hebrews 12 to see what we do once we have this amazing faith. How do we apply it to our lives? How do we keep our focus on God? I hope that you've enjoyed this story of Moses and the Israelites. There's a lot to take in here, so I hope that you go back and you reread these verses and really soak in what God has for you. Can't wait to see you next week to wrap up this video series. Have a great week.